Folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, radio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio on your, as you're driving along in your truck or your car or on public transport, put in those earbuds. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the wider issue of the housing shortage, which is all across the Western world. The reason there is a housing shortage is because the globalists are forcing mass migration on an unwilling population, and this is probably one of the primary causes of a so-called housing shortage. But there's no housing shortage in reality. There's just mass migration, and the governments, Western governments, are allowing, permitting, aiding and abetting, many would argue, the offshore purchasing, mass purchasing of residential real estate and also office real estate in the West. So let's just look at this. And now what's brought this on is there's been a number of documentaries, and it's a bit of a flavour of the month thing at the moment, a number of documentaries that purport to be investigating what they assert is a housing shortage. Now, they can get through 30 or 40 minutes of so-called investigative reporting, and from morally very superior people, and without not once mentioning mass migration and not once mentioning the mass buying up of residential property by the BlackRocks and the big financial institutions and offshore Chinese investors and so on. So that doesn't get mentioned. So they just really concentrate on two things. One is more houses need to be built. Again, they're not mentioning at all the mass migration, not even a sideways mention. And so they're looking at more houses need to be built, and that the vacant properties, of which there are many in Australia and elsewhere, London too, the vacant properties there needs to be more government action and intervention to put these vacant properties on the market. Now, the vacant properties thing is a reasonably valid point. At the same time as they're urging governments to build extra houses, they're also screaming about protecting the environment and how endangered species and endangered trees or endangered wetlands and these sorts of things have to be protected. So how exactly do you build more houses when they're also pursuing the green agenda, meaning there must be fewer houses or no more houses? So I don't know how they juggle that one, nor do they explain it in these so-called documentaries, which really are propaganda pieces disguised as supposed investigative reporting. So let's look at a few things here. Now, the push factors for not enough houses are of course mass migration. That's a key one. Secondly, of course, is the buying up of residential property by big investment firms and offshore investors. There are Chinese Communist Party generals that own 200, 300, 400 properties in Australia each. And there's plenty of them. It's not like there's one or two. In one of the wealthiest postcodes in Australia, just one Chinese Communist Party general owns 35 properties in the wealthiest postcode in Australia. So that gives you an idea as to why there are or the contributing factors to housing shortages. So you might ask, well, why don't the politicians do something about it? The answer is obvious: cut back on the migration and stop allowing offshore buying of real estate. Do those two things, the problem disappears. Well, number one is the mass migration is decided by the globalists. So they're globalist masters. There is not a single Western government that is sovereign anymore, not one. So they get their instructions on what they will and won't do from the globalist secretariat, and then that's what they do. The first thing that the globalists want, or their primary concern, is mass migration, shoving as many brown and black people into the West as possible. Now, a lot of the big investment firms are really what's called front running. So they know that the globalists are controlling the migration agenda, and they know that this will continue to force house prices and rents up. So they get in early and buy up vast swathes of real estate so they can sell it later at a windfall, zero risk, high return profit. So there's that. But it's also the politicians are part of the front. Western politicians are part of the front running. There was a time when, you know, a politician's income consisted 100% from their parliamentary income. They would get additional income for, say, being members of certain committees in the parliament and so on. And if they were chairman of the committee, then a bit more again. So they would get those sorts of things, but really their parliamentary income was it. Now, as the cost of living has gone through the roof, particularly with real estate, where real estate over the last 50 years has increased by many hundredfold, then the equation for living a middle class lifestyle has changed considerably. And the idea of politicians seeing themselves as servants of the people is long gone. So for a politician to live a upper middle class lifestyle, which they would think would be a minimum entitlement, then they need a far bigger salary than a politician's salary. So they have to make their money elsewhere. Now, the bulk of all politicians' incomes now, or certainly many politicians, and certainly the key politicians, the decision-making politicians, the bulk of their income comes from real estate investment, whether it's flipping real estate, whether it's buying up blocks of apartments and renting them out. It doesn't matter, but they're more than 50% of their income now comes from real estate investments, which will be an ongoing income they have when they leave political life. So this is something that's very important, and I've mentioned this many times before. But a politician can be the big financial end of town that controls the buying and the selling of real estate. Act as middlemen now for these politicians. So they'll go to the politician and say, "Look, there's a property down the road there. It's cost you $1 million, but it's really worth sort of $2 million. But we'll get it into you for cheap. We'll have low cost, finance. If the deal falls over, don't worry, we'll forgive you the loan," and so on. So it's a zero risk activity by the politician. There's no way they're savvy enough or experienced enough in real estate investment. So the bank's just holding them by the hand, saying, "Here it is. Here's a property, and then after 12 months, we'll introduce you to a very cashed up Chinese buyer that wants to launder a shitload of money, and they'll pay you $4 million for the property, and you'll make a windfall profit without any risk and without having to do any work." But that environment that allows the offshore buyer to come in, allows the banks or the big financial institutions to play these sorts of games, that environment is created by the offshore investment firms, whether it be a BlackRock or a cashed up Chinese party, Communist General. So that environment is facilitated. So if the politicians stop that, then they stop their own income. And anybody that wants to live a middle class lifestyle today has to be making. This is assumed they have no children, by the way. So it has to be making $350,000 a year if they want a middle class income. You've got to remember that just entry level into an upper middle class lifestyle in say Sydney now. The real estate prices begin at $4 million for a property, and that's not the ritziest property. You want to have the waterfront and the water views, and you want those sorts of things, and you're talking well in excess of that. That's just how expensive it is. And when that's how expensive it is to enter that sort of level of lifestyle, you need a certain amount of money to do it. And a politician's salary isn't enough. I'd rather politicians were paid more just so they weren't so fucking corrupt, because at the moment they're so easily bought and sold by the big financial and real estate investment firms, effortlessly bought and sold. And not only is it the politician's income, but here's a politician who's a senior decision-making politician, and all his children are in their 20s, and all of them have very, very well-paid jobs in the financial services sector. None of them have earned these jobs. None of them have the requisite credentials for these jobs. So they've been clearly gifted these jobs as I would argue, as corrupt payment for their father to make political decisions and sign off on legislative decisions and sign off on legislation that suits the big investment firms. So that's the overall sort of reality architecture, if you will, of what's going on. But coming back to the empty property, now there are supposed to be, depending on whose numbers you look at, somewhere between 1% and 2% of all residential properties in Australia are vacant. Now that's a little bit deceptive, because a lot of those properties are blocks of apartments, or say office blocks that are no longer being used, that could be converted into apartments, that type of thing. So when it's like 200,000 or 150,000 or whatever properties, several thousand of those could be 10 or 20 blocks. So there could be 10 or 20 apartments in each block. So then the number of dwellings, if you will, including apartments and freestanding houses, is closer to 250,000, or maybe even a little bit more properties. Or dwellings, individual dwellings. So we need to. So I think that investigative reporting there is probably about accurate, certainly based on the comparisons that I've seen. So there's a lot of properties. Why are these properties vacant? Well, the idea that they're just vacant because no one really knows. There's just owners that are sitting on them, and they're talking about owners in some cases that have owned the property for a decade or longer, 20 years, 30 years even, and there's no one living in the property, and so it should be available to be sold to someone who wants to live in it, or for that matter, rent it out to people who want to rent, and so on. And if all these properties were brought into the buying and the renting sort of space, then that would take a huge amount of pressure off. So it's argued, a huge amount of pressure off the house prices and rental prices and so on. I'm not so sure it would, or I think the effect would be somewhat minimum, because market forces are not what's driving house and rental prices. So we need to get past this idea that market forces are the main driver of these prices. They're not. There's nothing organic about these prices at all. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In regard to the properties that are unoccupied, what they're failing to observe in these documentaries or investigative reporting type segments are that a lot of the properties haven't been well maintained, and they're in a state where you couldn't put someone in to rent it, or you couldn't. It needs a lot of remedial work. And a lot of remodeling and so on to make it habitable. In some cases, the roof is in a poor state of repair, and every time it rains, it's a gushing torrent of water through the place. There are a whole lot of things. So many tens of thousands of these places need serious work. There's thought being put to increasing the tax on unoccupied property. So if it's unoccupied for more than 12 months, you have to pay a punitive tax. You either have to sell it, you've got to use it. It's supposed to be a place to live in, is the argument on one side of the equation, and you've either got to sell it to someone who wants to live in it, or you have to rent it out. So now I've got no problem with that. I don't think property should be left empty as just easy long-term investments, particularly if the person's inherited the property and it hasn't cost them anything to acquire. Then they've got much less interest in trying to, they're much less interest in sort of, they've got to get their money back because they put so much into it. And one assumes they're already in comfortable circumstances if they don't want to sell it or rent it out. If they wanted to. If they were hard up for money, you think they would sell it as quickly as they could. If they wanted it as a profitable, return, paying a return, then they would want to have it rented out. But given they've got neither one, you can assume their circumstances are so comfortable that they don't need even to give that a consideration. So on the idea of on this notion that there's a lot of property sitting out there unoccupied, not all of it is ready to be to take inhabitants, and not all of it would pass council requirements, although councils certainly look the other way these days on that score. So I think in overall terms, if those properties were all done up tomorrow and remodeled and made habitable, that it wouldn't make a particular dent, because again, as I mentioned a moment ago, there's a lack of market forces that are determining rental prices. When you get in the far outer suburbs of say Sydney or any of the bigger cities, then the prices, there's less. There's a greater inclination for property owners to take lower quality tenants, because the idea of being in the inner city and the convenience of living there, close to work, close to transport, close to shops, these sorts of things, that does drive up prices. And there is generally a lot of competition. If you want the inner city apartments walk to work, then you can get 50 or 60, 70 people queuing up. But even this is a little deceptive, because particularly Chinese and Indians and these sort of people, they tend to arrive in large clans. So 50, 60 people may only be 5 people who are actually viewing the property, because they'll arrive with 10 of their wider family or 10 of their tribe or brethren. The other thing to be aware of as well is, and something that's, if 100,000 people come into Australia as migrants, the media very disingenuously uses them, 100,000 properties are needed. Well, that's not true. The idea that they're all single people that are going to want, need, or even could afford their own property is their own dwelling is nonsense. These, particularly the students and the people, the peasants that are brought in to work at cleaning jobs and so on, they're being put up, or dishwashing jobs, they're being put up at 10 to 15 or even 20 to a 2-bedroom apartment. So we need to keep that in some sort of perspective. Also, when families come in and there's the mum, dad, and the 2 kids, they don't have a separate house each. 4 of them move into one house. So this idea that 100,000 people need 100,000 properties, that's simply nonsense. The bigger issue is the offshore buying of real estate and leaving it vacant. And even in this area, that we live in here, properties are sold to Chinese investors that can't speak a word of English, and they'll leave it vacant for 6 months, 12 months. Or if they do have somebody coming in, someone who turns up once a week to switch on the lights and do a couple of things and collect mail or something like that, then head off again. So it's or you get a situation where there's a 5-bedroom house not far from where we live, where there's one person living there after the Chinese investors bought the house. So there's also underutilization of real estate, where offshore investors again have purchased it. But there's a lot that goes into it. The interesting thing, I guess, or the most interesting factor about these documentaries is not one mentioned even once mass migration, as if it's not happening or it doesn't exist. I mean, insane. You've been with Tassless today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.